He earned his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago in 1984 and taught at Boston College for 21 years before joining Harvard in 2005. From 2010 to 2017, he was also the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. In July 2010, he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy and has served as a professorial research fellow at the Australian Catholic University. His primary areas of Indo-logical scholarship are theological commentarial writings in the Sanskrit and Tamil traditions of Hindu India. Hailed as a founder of modern comparative theology, Professor Clooney was given the 2017 John Courtney Murray Award for Distinguished Theological Achievement from the Catholic Theological Society of America. He is a leading figure globally in the field of comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning, deepened through the study of traditions other than one's own. He has also written on the Jesuit missionary tradition, particularly in India, on the early Jesuit Pan-Asian discourse on reincarnation, and on the dynamics of dialogue and interreligious learning in the contemporary world. In addition, he serves as a Roman Catholic priest in a Catholic parish on weekends, and has been a member of the Society of Jesus for 50 years. Father Clooney is a prolific author of articles and books, and it's a list so long, if I read it, it would take up the precious time that we want to spend listening to him and Swamiji discuss his most recent book that was published last year. Father Clooney, it is an honor and pleasure to welcome you here again, and I invite you and Swamiji to take us into your life and career, captured in this wonderfully titled memoir, Hindu and Catholic, Priest and Scholar, A Love Story.
Asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityur ma amritam gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real, lead us from darkness unto light, lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning and namaste, everybody. Welcome to Father Clooney, and we are so grateful to have him here back with us this morning. And on such an inclement morning too, the weather is so bad, but he traveled all the way from Boston yesterday and then walked down in the rain from where he was staying to the Vedanta Society. So, in addition to what Diane said, there is a special link that I have with Father Clooney, is that he was my mentor at the Harvard Divinity School. Among all the things that he has done at Harvard, at the Divinity School, and at the Center for Study of World Religions, one of the initiatives which he pioneered was inviting Hindu monks, Hindu monastics, to study at the Harvard Divinity School. And as part of this pioneering effort, I was in the first batch. And going back to school, and that to Harvard at this age, he was the guiding light there on what to study, what not to study. I didn't do, I must say frankly, in front of him, I think he must have noticed, I didn't do too much studying. I was running around attending this lecture, that lecture. One day I was attending a seminar in the Center for Study of World Religions, and I said, after seminars, you always have samosas. So I said, I have to run for some lecture I was attending. And he was like, goodness, you've got classes and seminars and lectures every day. But I had a wonderful time thanks to him, and that program continues. every year there have been other Hindu monastics who have attended the Harvard Divinity School in the program designed by Father Clooney. But today we're going to talk about this book, Hindu and Catholic, Priest and Scholar, A Love Story. This sums up a lifetime, and a very extraordinary lifetime, the outlines of which we just heard from Diane. Now, the first thing that I would like to ask, it's, of course, the focus is on Father Clooney. I'll just give some prompts and some questions, and then we'll have a conversation. And at the end of which, we'll have time, I promise you, we'll open it up to the audience, so you can ask questions. But we'll start with the book itself. How did you come to write this book? You know, the reason I ask is, you're a spiritual seeker, you're a Jesuit monk, you are a high-caliber intellectual academic, but all of these things are predominantly internal. I remember reading the introduction to Swami Brahmananda's biography written by Swami Prabhavanandaji, and he says it's very difficult to write the biography of spiritual seekers and saints because predominantly their life is internal. What prompted you to write this, and what was the model? How do you write such a book?
Thank you for a good opening question. I would like to add my sense of gratitude and happiness at being here today. I wish it was a warm and sunny day, but these things happen. But I was here in, I think, November of 2019, so it's nice to be back, and there are some familiar faces here. And as Swami said, he and I are now old friends. The only point I would dispute was I really your mentor or not. Swami was a dazzling figure on the Harvard campus, attracting so much appreciative attention in the classroom, also about the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and other texts, always bringing some wisdom to bear from practice and from knowledge that I appreciated and all of us appreciated. So it's been a great tradition that Swami helped get started back then. So my book, the main reason for doing the book was that you could see the picture on the cover of me when I was 51 years ago when I was young, so just to prove that I was once a young man. But more seriously, or more deeply, I think at a certain point in life, and I'm 74 now, at a certain point in life we begin to ask ourselves, what has it all added up to? What have we done? Why has it come out the way it has? What has been good or bad in our life story? And it seemed to me reasonable to think that since I have a rather unusual path, so being a Roman Catholic priest, being a Jesuit, and yet since 1973, when I first went to Kathmandu, engaging with Hindu traditions and a little bit with Buddhist traditions, and then studying and studying and studying, that it would be worthwhile to tell the story. Why did this come about and how did it come about? So it was both, at a certain age, you look back on your life, but also wanting to explain how is it possible that you can be rooted and grounded in one tradition and learn from another tradition at the same time. And I could have done that, theoretically. As an academic, I could have written a book, as I have, about comparative theology, which means faith seeking understanding across religious borders. But I find that people, including me, are very impressed by the personal story. Like, why did you do this? What did it mean for you? And I was inspired by examples that I know. In the West, St. Augustine wrote the Confessions, and that was a dominant book in telling the story of one's life. Up to modern figures, Thomas Merton, the famous monk, wrote Seven Storey Mountain. Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic Worker, wrote The Long Loneliness. And thinking that while it's less common in India, books that I've used in class like Gandhiji's Story of My Experiments with Truth, Autobiography of a Yogi, and so on. And then a little bit the accounts, essays or sermons that somebody like Swami Vivekananda, or in his own accounts that we hear in the Great Master and the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna himself, talking about things from his past. That this would be a good way to tell the story, would be to tell it as my story. And part of the theme of the book, of course, is that for younger people and people with different life stories, you do it differently. You don't try to imitate what I did. but you look into your own life and say, where am I coming from? What is going on in my life, and where is it going? And so all these kind of motivations came together in putting the book together. And I hope, it seems to serve a purpose, and I'm very happy to be here today to talk with you about it.
All right, thank you. We are glad you did. And this talk is not all about the book, it's just a segue into the book. So I would encourage you to actually go into the book and read it. The most difficult question, the first. It gets easier after this. We go to the heart of Francis Clooney here. In the beginning of the book, you say that your life and your work has been about one thing only. And you say that this is the key to all your work you're writing, and all your writing as if circles back to this one thing again. Mm-hmm. What is that one thing? And why is it important for a genuine spiritual seeker to be centrally about that one thing?
I think what I was trying to communicate early in the book, in the first chapter, was, on the one hand, a very traditional Irish Catholic New York upbringing. I was born in Brooklyn, grew up on Staten Island. Some of you, I'm sure, have been to Staten Island at one point or another. Went to Regis High School, which is across the park from here. Very happy to go to Regis. Went to Fordham University, so I have a lot of New York connections. I was an altar boy, served at the altar, old enough that I had the Mass in Latin first, and then after a year, Father in charge of the parish said, okay, now we're going into English, and things switched. In primary school, the sisters taught me. Every year, for the 8 years, I had a nun teaching me, and that's almost unheard of today. But great effect on being Catholic, Catholic family, growing up Catholic. But I realized none of that would really explain what motivates me when I was 20, when I was 22, and I went to Kathmandu, when I got my PhD at Chicago, when I taught at BC, when I taught at Harvard. What's kind of the energy? And I try to explain early in the book kind of an experience, kind of being Catholic, an experience within being Catholic that has kind of driven my life. Maybe I could read a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah. So the point of this really is to say that in my life, you could describe it as a Catholic life, and he's a Catholic, and he went to a seminary, and he became a Catholic priest. Nothing that surprising. But what is it that kind of you might say the moment of contact with God or enlightenment that opened things up? And I'll just read you a little bit from pages 9 and 10. On the night of July 6, 1966, when I was 15, I had what turned out to be the defining religious experience of my life, a single instance of God touch. It was a hot night, humid and even stifling. There was no air conditioner, but I think there was a little fan on the desk near my bed. It was quiet. I was alone in my childhood bedroom. I could not get to sleep. I was a teenage boy, restless in mind and body. Eventually, I knew I would fall asleep. I was not expecting anything unusual to happen. But then I felt a very strong presence, a physical nearness that I knew to be God coming to me. It was God entering into me, piercing me, taking hold of me inside. It was an intrusion, an awakening, like a sexual awakening. No words, no visions, just being touched, taken over inside, all in a moment. The original experience of God was a manner of self-love because it was about loving God within me, not God outside me. And I think over the years, when I've talked about my life, first of all, to myself, in some ways, everything I needed for my life was there in that moment. To go from being kind of culturally, family-wise, socially a Catholic and then a priest, the inner experience that made it come alive. And while I had heard no voice, there was no vision, and I didn't hear God saying to me, go to Kathmandu, study Hinduism, nothing like that. It sort of opened up the possibility of a living relationship to God, living contact with God, that somehow made everything possible. That I could remain in my own tradition because that's where God visited me, but I could also go further because God is everywhere around us. And I think in various intellectual ways as well as spiritual, it began to open up from there. And so when I look back in writing the book last year, it only came out last summer, I was really trying to say, my life is many things. I've written many articles and books and so on like that. There's really always this one thing. If you pay attention to where you are, if you realize that the God you talk about is the God who is within you, then you think differently, you act differently, you experience differently. And if you're a professor, you write it down sometimes. But it started that way, and it's continued to reverberate. Because how many experiences of God do we really need? If you have one, in a sense, that's enough for a lifetime.
It's so beautiful. And it's very, I think, it reminds me of one very great scholarly monk I studied under, Damodar Ashram, Dinu Pandit. He was nearly 100 when I when I started studying with him. And he told me an experience he had many, many decades ago. He was a traditional Sanskrit Pandit and going to study with his Pandit, studying with him and coming back to the monastery. And there was this old blind monk who would sit on the bank of the Ganga, and when he would cross the Ganga with the boat, come back to the monastery, he would ask him, "What did the Pandit teach you today?" And he would have to narrate the whole lesson, that day's lesson. So one day this monk had gone to the Pandit, and he saw the Pandit reading, and this monk asked him, the student, he asked him, "Oh, you're such a great scholar, but you're still reading at this age." And the Pandit said, "Unless I learn something new every day, I don't feel like living." My teacher, he said, I was so impressed with it. When I came back across the river to the monastery, and this old blind monk was sitting there, "What did the Pandit teach you today?" I narrated to him this story, that unless I read something new every day, I don't want to live. Unless I learn something new every day, I don't want to live. And then the old monk said to him, "That's a great ideal for a Pandit, but remember, the awakening to God takes place once, and it is the same all throughout your life. It's not different every day." No. But I think this is a beautiful combination of the monk and the Pandit that we see here. Both, yes. A central light, and of course, being fresh all throughout one's life. Which brings us to the next important question, which we all have. What's the connection between studying, reading, scholarship, and spirituality? How can scholarship help spirituality? Can it hinder one's spiritual growth? Can it help? And a specific question about how to read, because we have here a past master at close reading. So we should take advantage of while we have him here, we get the best practices, the secrets of reading texts, especially scripture.
I think the one little background piece I would give is that it's different for different people. Being the scholar and trying to have a spiritual life works out differently in different people. We're all intelligent, we all think, we all have questions, yes. And depending on your work, you could be a teacher, you could be a lawyer, you could be a medical doctor, you could be a bus driver, all kinds of things that require different kinds of intelligence. I'm a member of the Roman Catholic Church, and my order, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and many of you will know of the many schools we have, including Regis High School across the park and Fordham University in the Bronx, and all over India, Xavier this, Loyola that, and so on. So the expectation of the Jesuit order was to train scholars. And so when I entered the order in 1968, it was not having to make a special case why I would study. They wanted us to cultivate the spiritual life, to have a sense of vocation, the call of God. But the expectation was that we would have 10 years of training from entering the order to becoming priests, and that we should study. So in that tradition, it was not unusual to be a scholar. What I would say further, I think, is that on the one hand, there can be a real split between scholarship and faith. And sometimes it's professionally done on purpose. I know professors at Harvard and even at Harvard Divinity School who, in a sense, leave themselves out of their writing. I'm doing research on this topic. I'm a historian. I'm a cultural critic. I'm an archaeologist, a philologist. I'm just doing the work. You don't need to know anything about me. It's sort of impersonal or non-personal scholarship. And in many fields that can be accurate because you don't want personal bias, who you are and what you want to see happen. That's possible. And I also know people who, because they have deep faith and strong commitment, might already believe, I already know the answers. And so why have questions when you already know the answer? And I think the third way that really talking about like by the pundit and the spiritual person together is that, as I would put it in terms of my tradition, God gave us a brain to use. And that God expects us to use our brains well, and that if you have a curious mind, if you have the opportunities to study, to go to school, then is not contrary to the spiritual life. It's not a substitute. Like, instead of having a spiritual life, now I'll be a scholar. I have no time to pray, I'll just write my books. No, not that. But rather that the same kind of energy that drives being a Swami, being a priest. So I, as Diane mentioned, I do go to a parish every Sunday, except when I'm here, and give the sermon in the church and so on like that. Those things are all important, but it's not like then I become a different person on Monday morning and become the professor. But rather, in my tradition, we could talk about theology, which is faith-seeking understanding. So not understanding seeking faith or looking to believe in something, but because you believe, you have questions. And because you believe deeply, you try to have questions in the world in which you live, in 2025. And so I think part of the drive for me has been, if you are a spiritual person who's been given the advantages of education, I've had the opportunity to study, the blessings of being a professor at Boston College and now at Harvard, all these blessings really add up to do something that shows what faith-seeking understanding is about. And for me, part of it could be, in my own tradition, so many Catholic professors at Fordham University, Georgetown, Boston College, Notre Dame, and so on, seeking to understand their faith. But for me, it got kind of pushed across the border and saying, well, why stop at the edges of my own religious tradition? Why not learn from other faith traditions, read their texts, learn from their texts, go to the holy places, go to temples and shrines, join festivals, listen to bhajans, and so on like that. All of that expands the questioning, the wondering, the wonderment about what God is all about. And I would say that some of us do that in a more technical fashion. So we write the books and so on. But it really comes down to not a bifurcated life, spiritual, intellectual, or professor and religious person like fighting with each other. But one way of service is to serve by being a teacher, by being a scholar, by writing the books. And I think that's a blessing. But we have to keep it on balance, that one doesn't stop praying or doesn't forget the spiritual grounding. So when I teach a text like the Bhagavad Gita, which I'm doing right now, and of course that Swami was in when we were inconveniently interrupted by COVID in March of 2020, and everybody got home and we did the rest of the course on Zoom, to try to show the students, yes, you have to understand the Bhagavad Gita, you actually have to read it. You have to pay attention to translation problems. You have to think about the points Sri Krishna is raising. But then also be open to it. What does it teach you, me at my age, but the students in class? I have graduate students and undergraduates. What do I learn from Sri Krishna that helps me in 2025? And if you left that out and said, I'm sorry, we're just studying the history of the text, that would be something missing, I think. So trying to do both, but challenging students, think, question. Don't be afraid of your brain, because, again, God gave that to you as well.
It's beautiful. Swami Vivekananda said, a man must not only have faith, but have intellectual faith too. The intellect must be involved in our spiritual practice. But coming back to, again, reading, how one of my teachers, a monk, told us that you don't read anymore, you just flip.
Yeah.
What's the difference between flipping through a book and reading?
Yeah.
What do you mean by close reading?
I think we live in a time in which, so when I was at Regis High School across the park, I did 4 years of Latin, 3 years of Greek, and basically our education was reading Latin classics, Greek classics, getting into the text. When I studied in India in the 80s and 90s in Mylapore in Chennai, I was sitting with pundits who would read the text very closely, and we'd learn a little bit each day. I never learned enough, certainly, but we learned a little bit each day. And I think what I was being trained, both in my own tradition and by studying in India with pundits, was that somehow to go slowly and actually pay attention to what is being said, and often it's a matter of translation, getting the right words in the right way, and then thinking about it, is actually better than covering a book this week and another book the next week and a third book the third week and so on like that. The danger of flipping. I find that for students today who are on their phones, I have my phone in my pocket, I promise not to take it out while talking, that there's a sense of, well, we don't, we just sort of know about the book. Let's talk about the gospel. Let's talk about the Gita. Let's talk about the great master of the gospel of Ramakrishna. Let's talk about these things. But to actually sit down and read a chapter and ponder what is being said, books, if you read them closely, are actually sometimes very surprising because they don't say what you thought they would say. Even with a gospel passage that I would read for church on Sunday, to read what it actually says, there are puzzles in the Gospels that you miss if you read it broadly. So Jesus cured the blind man. Jesus multiplied loaves and fishes. But then you read the passage and there are these odd statements about what people thought or why Jesus did this or how people reacted to him. Suddenly it comes alive, and with the Psalms in the Bible, poetry and all that, it opens up even more. As I just mentioned, teaching the Bhagavad Gita Tuesday this week, we're doing chapter 2, verses 39 to 72. So the Sthita Prajna section, the introduction of Karma Yoga. But there are many kind of puzzling shlokas in that section that are not covered by just saying, Karma Yoga, detached action, steady wisdom. And that working it through, as we'll do in class, little by little, raises more questions, unsettles, I thought, as students will tell me, students of South Asian origin, for instance, I grew up in a Hindu household. We always had the Bhagavad Gita on the shelf. My grandmother would recite it in the morning. I never actually read the book. And to realize, it's more complicated than I thought it was. It's more interesting than I thought it was, is a wonderful thing. And to open it up by realizing, in a sense, if you have 1 or 2 or 5 books, that could keep you for a year. You don't need 100 books or 200 books. I do have 1,000 books probably, but nonetheless, reading something slowly and savoring it and going back to it, it's a spiritual practice. It's a kind of shravana, manana, that I think opens things up for us, that we should not neglect in the rush to a book a week kind of quick reading, which is really much less useful.
Right. Vedanta especially Shravana is a lot about reading. It's about listening to the text, and nowadays, of course, reading the text systematically. Mm-hmm. I remember this very senior monk in our order. We were asked to go and see how he reads. His name was Shikshananda, which is happily named as a teacher, one who delights in education. Of course, there's a Vedic meaning of it also as the Do you want me to open this?
I'll fight with it later.
Okay, can you open this? Yeah.
Yeah. It would be
And whenever we would go to him, he would be sitting in his
Thank you.
armchair with the commentaries of Shankara open. We as novices, brahmacharis, would go and bow down to him, and he would look at us and nod and go back to the studying of the commentaries of Shankara, which he had read for 60 years maybe. So it's not something that he's reading. It's not the latest in the New York Times bestsellers list. So it's a way of keeping your mind on a very profound truth, and which brings us to a book. In the Jesuit tradition, I think a central text is the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius Loyola. Tell us about it, especially some insights or practices which we can all benefit from it.
Okay. So I'm a Jesuit in the Society of Jesus, and our founder was Ignatius of Loyola, a town in the Basque area of Spain. He was born in 1491, died in 1554, and he had an ordinary life at the beginning. He was actually becoming a soldier. He was like a mercenary fighting in these little wars between this prince and that prince, and just hoping to succeed in war, make some money, become famous, marry, settle down, have a family. But he was wounded in the battle. Apparently a cannonball broke his leg. And he was in bed for a year because the leg was all crooked. And they had to, every once in a while, it's hard to imagine, break it again to straighten it out. And he was in terrible pain for much of the year, and I think to the end of his life he limped. But during that year, he was very frustrated and annoyed, and he wanted to, get back out there and do it. And he had some books, whatever books were available in the 16th century, some kind of romances, love stories. Probably not 100 because books were precious in those days, but a few of them. And he would read them about romance and fighting in battles and all that, and he'd just become all the more impatient and all the more kind of I want to get out there. I'm so annoyed at this and angry at the food and angry at the nurse and all that. And then somebody had given him a gospel and a life of Christ. And he found that when he got tired of the novels and picked up the life of Christ or the gospel, suddenly everything quieted down. And he began to realize that reading about the saints and really reading about the life of Jesus somehow shifted him from the kind of the active, impatient, material way of thinking over to a more spiritual path. And by the end of the year, when he could walk again and left the bed, he didn't want to be a soldier again. And he realized that there was something going on in his life, that these moments of darkness and impatience and anger were counterbalanced by this peace and consolation and joy. So he went off to live in a cave by himself. He went off to live in a cave and spent some months in a cave in a place called Manresa. And in that cave, he began to realize that endlessly, all the time, God was speaking to him, not in words, not in visions, but by feelings in his heart, uplifting feelings, depressing feelings, and that he began to sort out what God wanted him to do with his life by not simply following his gut feelings, but by realizing that God was influencing how he felt in himself. He then said what to do with this, and he went to live in the Holy Land in Jerusalem, and after a while that didn't work. He came back, and he studied at the University of Paris. He was there for some time as a student, and began to gather young men, mainly I think men were maybe the only students there in those days, 16th century, around him, and began to explain to him what his own spiritual experience had been. And that it's not simply about having a Bible or reading it or having the rules of the church and telling you what to do, but rather to slow down, take some time to do what he began to call the spiritual exercises. And the spiritual exercises is both a book, a little book, not a very big book, but also the practices in the book in which he tried to share with his immediate companions, but then with others who came looking for advice on how to live their lives, about how do I look into my life when I'm not having visions or voices, but I want something more than I have, how to read my life, like read my heart. And so he divided it into 4 periods. And if you did it properly, you would go off by yourself with a priest usually for a month. you'd live in solitude, you wouldn't talk to anyone. And then you had like 4 periods. The first period, which was usually about 7 days, was to talk about how am I as a human being? Sin, attachments, greed, anger, fear, things I've done wrong in my life, mistakes I've made in my life, pondering when I get to the end of my life, what will it add up to? And so it's very dramatic about, think now while you're young, because when you're old, it may be too late to begin to change your life. The second week, though, is a longer period, like 10 days, is simply to go through gospel passages of the life of Christ. And that rather than simply the rational mind telling you, right and wrong, true and false, if you go to the gospel and you read the stories of Jesus as teacher, Jesus as healer, Jesus walking with his disciples, Jesus, again, multiplying loaves and fishes and so on, you begin to ponder these scenes as if they were alive for you now. And every day you would have one scene. So loaves and fishes, healing the blind man. And you would meditate on it in the morning in general. You'd remember the passage, you might read the passage. Then the second time in the morning, you'd go simpler to the part that interested you most. So Jesus and the blind man, you begin to get into it and sort of think, what would it mean to be blind from birth? What would I look like? How would it be, my life different if I was blind from birth? And then what would it be like, a blind person, to suddenly feeling the presence of this Jesus who walks up? And then the third meditation and the fourth meditation in the afternoon, you go focus in like further, like what really mattered when Jesus said to me, what can I do for you? And he said, that's sort of the crux, that it finally comes down to not the general passage, Jesus is good and kind, but suddenly I'm part of the story. I'm the blind man, I'm the crippled woman, and Jesus says, what can I do for you? And then realize those words are not 2,000 years old, they're spoken to me right now. And you do this day after day after day after day, and then he says, now stop and think again, what does God want you to do with your life? And it's really, you've been changed because you're constantly meditating on Jesus without any distractions. And then you can go back with more simplicity and openness to, what now does God really want of me? Does God want me to marry and have children and a family? Perfectly fine. Does God want me to be a lawyer or a doctor? Does God want me to leave everything and follow like St. Francis of Assisi did, whatever? And then to deepen it, the third period is meditating on the passion and death of Jesus and realizing both the sorrow of his suffering but also the depth of his love. And for those 5 or 6 days, you do the same thing. You get a scene like Jesus in the garden, Jesus at the table, Jesus being nailed to the cross, and all day long you go deeper and deeper. Like, what would I do if I was standing there at the cross? How would I see the blood dripping from his nail, the nails in his wrist? And then say, what would I say if Jesus looked at me? What would I say to him? And then the fourth week, you might say, is the Easter story. You have like 4 or 5 days at the end where you meditate on all the stories of the resurrection, the surprise of the women at the tomb, suddenly the dead one is alive again, and then suddenly hear the mission, go and tell my disciples that I've risen. And then realize, surprisingly, he's talking to me. Oh my God, what should I do? And it opened up, and then he says, go back out into the world, 30 days finished, and find God in all things. And to finish this off, and then we could go deeper, I guess, I think part of the beautiful simplicity of it, it's a very boring book to read, because it's like reading a cookbook. It tells you, do this, take this 4 or 5 times a day. But if you do it, it's very powerful. It's exercises, spiritual exercises. And he has a plan, and yet he says at several points, when you find something that is spiritually satisfying, don't rush on. So if every prayer period you make an act of the presence of God, you realize God is already here and I'm in God's presence. And I always found that if you understand that, you can't really quickly go any further. Because what more do you need than the presence of God? And other times he say, if you find something that speaks to your heart, stay with that. So the rest of the meditations could just be that again. And maybe the next day you're supposed to move on to another story. He seems to give you the freedom just to stay with what is still working in you from yesterday. So in a sense, a very clear plan, but on another level, freedom, talking to your guide who's guiding you through it. Where is the voice of God? Where is God touching me at the moment? And this was given to all the first Jesuits. And when I was a novice, we did the 30 days. And then every year making an 8-day version of it. And then years later did another 30-day version. And even now, some 56, 57 years a Jesuit, still kind of every summer go back to it again. Maybe not so formally. I've even been in contexts where asking, and people have asked, do you have to be a Christian to do the spiritual exercises? And the answer for many now is no. That on the one hand, it could be, literally, everybody can benefit from studying, hearing the stories of Jesus. It's not like a property of the Christians only. But I think you could do an adaptation of it with the Gospel of Ramakrishna, for instance. Taking a series of scenes and just slowly working them through and realizing that it's part of your life. But I think it's the energy there of that God is already with you, God is already touching you, and if you realize that, then everything else in your life can flow.
It's beautiful. I think we can adapt it into any tradition we are in, a similar set of exercises.
Yeah.
Yes. That importance of stopping, not being in a hurry to go on to the next practice, next book, next lecture, next YouTube to talk, to stop and stay. In the dialogues with Sri Ramakrishna, somebody said, sort of sage-like, oh, this is an endless path. There's more and more, there's no end to it. Sri Ramakrishna corrected him rather sharply. He said, no, where you find peace, that is the end. Stop.
Okay, yeah, same thing. Yeah.
Now that brings us to a broader theme of your love affair with Hinduism and the languages which have mediated this, Sanskrit and Tamil. How did you come to Sanskrit? How did you come to Tamil? And what is it that draws you and sustains your interest in Sanskrit and Tamil?
So this is a kind of thing that, when you talk about somebody who's a scholar, they do things that many people would not have the opportunity to do. Now I realize that many of you probably are fluent in 2 or 3 languages, just growing up with them. I grew up with American English, so I wasn't fluent in anything else. My English is pretty good, but otherwise it was only English that really mattered. But I mentioned at high school, across the park, we learned Latin and Greek, 4 years Latin, 3 years Greek, 2 years French, in fact. Then I picked up German to pass the reading exam in college, and so on. So a great appreciation of language, and going back to the original and getting the original words and the sound and the hearing it spoken. Because every translation, they say limps or falls short of the original, even though we have to use them most of the time. So when it came to South Asia, I spent 2 years in Kathmandu after college. I learned, it was an English medium school, St. Xavier's School, which the king of Nepal had invited the Jesuits in around 1950 to run a school to educate the boys in English medium so that they could become, educated, literate, without having to go to study in India or UK or something like that. There was a wall on the other side. The German nuns were teaching the girls, so they were the same kind of practice going on. And I picked up some Nepali, but I wasn't very good at it. But when I was ordained a priest in 1978, then the superior asked me, I had to talk to the superior about, now what? You've spent 10 years becoming a priest, now what are you going to do? And I said, and I wanted to do Indian studies, Hindu studies. Because my experience in Nepal and all the boys I taught were Hindu and Buddhist, in the Kathmandu Valley, going to Bodhnath and Swambanath, Pashupati, Dakshin Kali, all these beautiful temples in the valley, I wanted to go deeper. And for me, going deeper meant learning language, studying language, getting inside the languages too. And the Superior looked at me like I was from the moon, because you're an educated priest, you can study theology and teach theology. But I explained to him that if I didn't learn the languages, I never really would get inside. At least I didn't think. People can get inside by meditation or by meeting a saint or whatever. But I felt for me it was like learn. So I did, the year after I was ordained, I did some parish work. I studied some more theology, and I started Sanskrit at Harvard. So I did a year of Sanskrit at Harvard, which most priests don't do when they're ordained. They don't do a year of Sanskrit. But I did a year of Sanskrit, and then for my doctoral program, went to the University of Chicago. And basically, we had, in the South Asia department, South Asian Languages and Civilizations, we had 3 years of coursework, and it was basically read. So I was reading Sanskrit all the time with different professors, very learned people. And the idea was that the more you read, the better off you are. And not, again, as I said before, it doesn't mean quantity necessarily, but going deeper into a text and the commentary, and then reading it over, reading it aloud, and so on like that, all of that. And so that's when I began to read Purva Mimamsa, one of the darshanas, and Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, then Vishishta Advaita, Ramanuja's Vedanta, and so on. But we also had to study a second language, which I was not quite aware of when I got there. I thought I would just do Sanskrit. And they basically said, well, you have a week to decide what your second language is. And the choices were Urdu, Hindi, Bengali, or Tamil. And I knew basically nothing about any of them, except that Rabindranath Tagore was from Bengal, and he wrote beautifully in Bengali and so on. But some of the professors said, because I had theological and religious interests, I should do Tamil. And even the professor of Bengali studies, Edward Dimmock, he said, no, you should do Tamil. That's what you're meant for. And that opened up another whole level of my life, because although in theory it was supposed to make me a fluent speaker of Tamil, which I am definitely not, I'm sorry to say, I became a pretty good reader of Tamil, and got back into the classical literature, the Sangam poetry, and so on. And then came upon, my professor at Chicago was A.K. Ramanujan, who was a great scholar, poet, translator, and so on. And when I was there, he was finishing a book called Hymns for the Drowning, which was about the Alvars, the Tamil saints. And he showed me what he was doing, and immediately I found that it was personal for me. The beauty of this poetry, the poignancy of what the saints were saying, and then the fact that there were like 4 or 5 or 6 commentaries on every verse, the learning of the tradition, sometimes mixing Sanskrit in with the Tamil. So I was on the one hand doing something fairly rational, even dry, Purva Mimamsa, and going in that direction, ritual texts and so on like that. On the other hand, I was reading the poetry of the Alvar saints, very passionate and very personal. And it worked out for me. It kind of appealed to 2 sides of me, the very philosophical side, analytic side, and the personal, devotional side. And up to now, I still read in Sanskrit and read in Tamil. And I think that was so important for me. Again, many of you are already think, speak in multiple languages, so it's no news to you. But for me, it was news that if I could read something in Latin or Greek in my own tradition, doing the work of reading something in Sanskrit or Tamil was a wonderful way of kind of making it real, to cross over, to learn from the other, and to not be really good at what I know and then superficial about what they say, but rather to learn from both. Just this morning, before coming, I was looking out, looking out the window where I was staying. I was fixing a translation of the poetry of one of the Alvars, because I'm publishing a little book of verses of one of the Alvar saints from about the 7th century. And I was going over it again. I've translated it many times now, but going over the English, trying to make the English sound better, and then looking at the original, looking at the translation. So it's both learning the languages and then the work of translation where you look in your own language for words that echo the words of the original. And that's a teaching practice as well. But I think if I hadn't learned the languages, for me at least, I would have always felt like I'm on the outside looking in.
And that's very interesting, the choice of these two languages. These are the two most ancient languages in India, Sanskrit and Tamil.
Yeah.
And they are also the keys to two parallel traditions also, which intermingle but also have their independent existence. And that brings you to Ramanuja, who has, there's a Tamil tradition to Ramanuja and a Sanskrit tradition to Ramanuja. So what attracted you to Ramanuja, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta?
Yeah, I think, again, I did some of my original work in the Purva Mimamsa, which is the ritual thinking. Another name for Vedanta is Uttara Mimamsa, like the second Mimamsa, taking the same reading principles and applying to the Upanishads and analytically studying them and so on. And the first I read was Shankara. And I still go back and read Shankara sometime. He's such a brilliant thinker. I'm actually doing a reading course now on the Viveka Chudamani with two students who are eager to read kind of what they would call more philosophical Sanskrit. But when I found Ramanuja, this was like a perfect second step. Not polemically like, is Ramanuja right or Shankara, let's fight or something. But because, as you say, Ramanuja's there. We just celebrated in 2017 a millennium of his birth anniversary. He's there, well versed in the Sanskrit tradition. He knows the Gita, the Upanishads, Vishnu Purana, other texts. He's learned it in the Sanskrit. But by all the accounts, he's also a devout Sri Vaishnava in the Tamil tradition. He doesn't write anything in Tamil, but the stories about him from even that time period talk about him listening to the poetry, going to Sri Rangam temple, hearing the recitation of the Alvar, and having tears in his eyes as he hears the Tamil being spoken. So there's a kind of interesting mix where you have the Upanishadic teachings of the Upanishads, more philosophical, Atman, Brahman, the Purushottama, Vishnu as the Lord. And then the other side was the devotional poetry. And right after he apparently instructed his disciples, I didn't write anything in Tamil, but I want you to read the Alvars, read the poets, and then bring Sanskrit learning into contact with the Alvars and read back and forth between the traditions. He also reformed the Sri Rangam temple. He regularized who was doing the pujas, the family traditions, organized, I think, the economics and all that. So he had this brilliant mind. He could do the study and also the other kind of practical work. He also wrote one of his 9 works that I translated a few years ago called the Nitya Grantham, the Nityam, which is, I translated like a manual of daily worship for the prapanna, for the person who's advanced in their devotionalism. And it's a text that gives you a kind of very clear outline of what you do for your morning puja. And you purify, you go to the bank of the river, you clean the ground, you prepare everything, and then you start chanting your mantras. And part of the chanting of the mantras, before you actually do like your offerings of the flowers and fruit and so on, is you kind of do mantras that lead you up through the universe up to Vaikuntha. And the mantras like greeting different deities and saints along the way. And then you're at the feet of Vishnu, Sri Vishnu, and then you have mantras that lead you back down. And then you do your puja, you make the offerings, and then you share them with others. It's not clear who the others are, but it says share them with Vaishnavas. And then you basically come to a conclusion and you say, I'll be back tomorrow. So back to the question of like the pundit and the devotee, Ramanuja in a work like this shows himself to be learned and scholarly and also able to prostrate himself on the ground, that he's not ashamed to be a devotee. Another of his works, the Sharanagati Gadyam, is a work of surrender to God, where it's all about you finally realize in your life everything is from God and to God, and therefore I am helpless, I can do nothing on my own, and I surrender at the feet of the Lord. And so touching the feet of Sri Ramakrishna, touching the feet of a Swami, is a symbol of this like surrender and need for God's intervention. And I think this it should speak to Christians and Muslims and Jews as well, that ultimately we learn from a teacher like Ramanuja, give yourself over to God, realize that without God's intervention, you're really nothing much. You really can't do it on your own. So it all woven together, and I think for me, appreciating Shankara, but appreciating Ramanuja as kind of the integral, whole, intellectual, spiritual person whose effects still continue today. If some of you may be Sri Vaishnavas, and the Sri Vaishnava tradition is very alive, and there are beautiful temples in India. Also, I spoke back in June in the Venkateshwara Temple in Pittsburgh, and they asked me actually to talk about Ramanuja. So a very living tradition in the U.S., just as you have other Gaudiya Vaishnavism and Shaivism and so on like that, all of which flourish. This was, for me, it seemed to be the one to study, and I learned so much from, in my own tradition, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and so on, and from Shankara, and then particularly from Ramanuja, about how to put everything together. And I still try to do it, keep going.
Wonderful. Talking about different traditions in Hinduism, one thing about Professor Clooney is that he has been close to us and a close friend to the Ramakrishna Vivekananda movement for many decades now. Tell us a little bit about that. How did you come in touch with the Ramakrishna order? Was it you met Swami Tyaganandaji in Chennai? Mm-hmm. How did all that come about?
I think, as far as I can recall, I first heard the name Ramakrishna when I was in Kathmandu. So I taught school there after college, 1973, 1975. And it was some passing reference, and there may have been some group that would gather for Ramakrishna devotion. Is there a center in Kathmandu?
There's a center now, yes.
Now, maybe not then. But I heard the name, and then I think when I started, so it was in my head somewhere, when I started teaching at Boston College, I did a course on saints of India. And I did, saints like Mirabai, Andal, even the Buddha, other figures. But somehow it clicked for me, Ramakrishna should be part of the course. So I started bringing Ramakrishna into my teaching. And fascinating to me, still fascinating to me, but also to the students, this man who had this kind of intuitive sense of the divine, this ability to realize God's presence in nature, not being satisfied with the pujas that he was doing, but realizing Kali was right there, she actually is, and then giving himself over to the ecstasies and speaking beautifully his poetry, singing and so on, and then influencing other people. So I think I began to appreciate him more and more by reading the great master in particular and bringing him into my teaching. And then I realized 1986 was the 100th anniversary of his passing. And I wrote an article for the Catholic magazine America, so a Jesuit magazine published over near Columbus Circle. There's a Jesuit house that publishes this magazine, America. I did a piece on the 100th anniversary of the passing of Sri Ramakrishna. And I think it was very new and informative for the people there, readers of this Catholic magazine. But it then began to be noted, and I got several notes from Swamis. I think one was from Swami Lokeshwarananda in Calcutta. But Sister Vrajaprana, if you know her out at Montecito, Pravrajika Vrajaprana, she wrote me a beautiful letter, because we didn't do email in the 80s, so about how it was wonderful and how it spoke to her, and she was happy to be able to read that a Catholic priest and so on wrote this piece. So we started having a correspondence. And then when I went to Mylapore to study the Alvars in 92, she said, well, there is this wonderful Swami there, a friend of mine, Swami Tyagananda. at the Mylapore Mutt, the Ramakrishna Mutt in Mylapore, who's the editor of Vedanta Keshari. And so then I'd bicycle over to his place. It was still safe in the 90s to bicycle in India. Now I don't think so. Over to the mutt, and we'd have conversations and tea and so on like that. And we became good friends and kept in touch over the years. And then, as he always remembers, I said, because he's so learned and so clear a speaker and so obviously spiritual person, you would be the perfect Swami for Boston, where Swami Sarvapriyananda, of course, was the Swami for many years. And he said, oh, that's a beautiful idea, it'll never happen. But then when Swami Sarvapriyananda needed an assistant, the order asked Tyagananda to come to Boston. And so I see him regularly. And we even have done a course on Hindu ministry, Hindu spiritual care, 3 times now, where we team teach. I would not do it without him, and he wouldn't do it without me. So we sit up there in the front and we talk about issues in ministry, hospital care, campus ministry. We read text together and all that with a group of students. So that was, all this became part of like my connections to the order. A number of times when I was in India, Lokeshwarananda would invite me up to Gold Park to speak at the Cultural Institute there. And then in this country, Swami Chaitanananda in St. Louis would ask me to write things occasionally for some of his books or something like that. Sarvapriyananda would invite me to speak at the center in Boston, and I invited him to speak at Boston College when I was there. And I was just in Montecito a few weeks ago, where I gave a talk about my book. Vrajaprana invited me out there. So long connections. I think maybe you could say that the Ramakrishna order and the Jesuit order have something in common in terms of, both a structure, a monastic life, and then also service of the people in different ways, schools and healthcare and so on like that. So it's a good resonance, grounded in Ramakrishna himself, and then Swami Vivekananda, but then also other levels of friendships and learning and all that kind of blossomed over the years.
It's beautiful. Changing the subject a little bit, let's get into the work, the sort of the heart of the work that you've been doing for decades. There's a field called comparative theology, and Professor Clooney is the pioneer. He is the founding father of that field. What is comparative theology?
So we have theology, and I mentioned before that theology in a very simple way can be called faith-seeking understanding. And basically, you are a believer, but you still have questions. You want to understand what you believe. You ask the questions. So this is a basic form, which in the Christian tradition is basically studying Christian sources. So the Bible, the fathers and mothers of the early church, the learned scholars, up to modern times, understanding the Bible and the tradition in 1800, 1900, 2025. What does the Bible mean today? What do we say to people about understanding who God is, or that there is a God? What does Jesus mean for people in our time and place? All those kinds of questions. And I'd say probably 98% or more of theologians basically work within their tradition, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox. I think, the term may not be used, but there can also be Hindu theologians and Buddhist theologians in a different way, studying one's own tradition and then promulgating it, giving discourses for the modern world and thinking about it. But comparative theology was to push a little further by saying that, as I said earlier, the learning and asking questions in faith doesn't have to stop at the edge of one's own tradition. You can cross over and learn from another tradition at the same time. I learned in the course of inventing comparative theology that the term had been first used in 1700, so I wasn't quite the inventor, and has a history over time of comparing theologies, like comparing different traditions. But what I meant by it was the same kind of reverence and spirit and willingness to learn that you would learn from your own tradition. You then pick up a text of another tradition and you learn from that. Again, the Gita and Upanishad, a teaching of a master or whatever. If you can learn theologically as a Catholic, as I do, by being in church, the great feast of the year, Christmas, Easter, Good Friday, and so on, you can also learn and deepen your faith by going to a temple or a mosque. And so basically expanding the circle of theology outside one's own tradition, not becoming a relativist saying, I'm neither here nor there, I'm just moving around and I have no grounding or roots, but rather I'm like a pilgrim. I go and I come back, I go and I come back. And this became, as a personal thing, it's what I do. It's what I have a chapter in the book about comparative theology. But it's also a field. And so in the theology department at Boston College, one of the best in the country, I created this discipline of comparative study where people could be doing Christian theology and then minor, have a subject field in Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, and so on. And then at places like the big religion meeting, American Academy of Religion, to have a comparative theology group where people would give papers exploring how they have learned from other people's religious traditions, either in general or on a topic like creation, birth and rebirth, love, the meaning of love. So it has become a useful field, I think, because it appeals to people who want to keep their own faith tradition and learn interreligiously, to cross over from here to there and back. There are different other ways to cross over and back, but I think in terms of understanding intellectually one's own and the other as a person of faith, this works out pretty well. And so books I've written, like Hindu God, Christian God, about 25 years ago, on learning principles of what God means in Hindu context, what God means in Christian context, about existence of God, creation, revelation, and so on, showing that if you understand your own tradition, you understand it better if you learn from another tradition at the same time. Or a book that's related to a course I'm teaching right now, Divine Mother, Blessed Mother, Hindu Goddesses and the Virgin Mary. So going into some goddess texts, in the book I had Sri Lakshmi, Mahadevi from the Saundarya Lahari, which some of you will know, and then a Tamil text, the Abhirami Andadi, and then paired to that different Marian texts. And in the book and then in the course, going back and forth. What's not in the book that I've brought in the course is Kali. So reading, poetry of Kali, devotion to Kali, Ramakrishna and Kali, and then realizing it's not quite parallel in the Marian tradition, but saying Kali too we can learn from, and then thinking differently about Mary because of the goddesses, thinking differently about the goddesses because of Mary, back and forth. So those are examples of comparative theology. And I think you can do it. It doesn't have to be Christian plus. It could be Buddhist, Hindu, it could be Hindu, Muslim, like Sufi poetry and mystical poetry of Hindu tradition. It could be Jewish, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist. You can mix it up in many different ways. But the point is you have faith, you keep your faith, and then you go about learning interreligiously. And that's what I mean by comparative theology.
I think the importance of that is an academic side to a real phenomenon in the world where people are already moving across traditions. People could be rooted in one tradition and are automatically, the culture makes you explore other traditions automatically. You're exposed to Sufi music, you're exposed to Buddhist meditation, you're exposed to Christian mysticism. So I guess comparative theology is sort of at the academic heart of all of this.
Yeah, and it's at the academic heart, so it's an academic discipline. But it's also like, so hearing like the recitation of the Quran or hearing Sufi poetry, I want to also know what it means. And so listening to it, either getting a translation or learning it, reading a good translation of the Quran, a certain surah, reading the Alvar poetry instead of just listening to it. So kind of studying it with an idea to understand it, still appreciating it, but then listening to it, going on let's say going to a festival. So you can go to a church on Christmas or Easter. then studying more about it, like what does this mean? Why do they have those prayers? Why do they light that candle? What do they do? And likewise me going to a temple, let's say Shivaratri is coming up soon, or Diwali in the fall and so on like that. What exactly are these practices? What does it mean? Learning from it on multiple levels is very timely. And I think the point of the scholar is just that we can do it better if we understand what we're doing. So you don't have to have a PhD to go to a church on Christmas or a temple on Diwali, but sometimes somebody should step back and say, now this is what it meant when it started, this is what it means in 2025, is just a good way of kind of keeping it alive and on target, I think.
One question, a general question before we open it up to the audience. You've been teaching for decades now in Boston College and at Harvard, and you've seen some of the brightest young minds in the world, not just in America, but people come from, especially at Harvard, they come from all across the world. So what are you seeing in the youth in terms of academics? Because I'm talking about the disruption which has been caused by computers, social media, and all of that over the last decade or so. But also in general, in terms of interest in religion, more specifically, maybe interest in a committed spiritual life or monasticism, across all these dimensions. It's like a bird's eye view over the decades.
Yes, that's a long bird's eye view. So I'm in my 41st year of teaching at the university level, so I have a lot to think about. And all over these years, at BC first and now at Harvard, teaching at BC I taught more undergrads and fewer grad students. At Harvard it's more grad students, fewer undergrads, because it's a divinity school is grad students. But PhD students, and then people in the 2-year master's program or the 3-year master's program, and then students from the college. And as you say, these are extremely talented, bright young people. On the one hand, I think some want to be professors, and many of them, I think probably for the better in terms of their generation, are not simply text people. They want to do like ethnographic work, they want to do field work, they want to get into lived religion. What actually do people do? They want to see how people act in a temple, or how people act and fast in a certain season, and so on like that. So for some, there's still the hardcore study, reading the Sanskrit, the Tamil, the Latin, the Greek, and so on. And for others, it's more mixing in with people and learning through personal contacts, going and living in an Indian village for a year, and then taking notes. You get friendships and you develop with the people. So there are changes in the academic field, which in I think every field change over time, and generations are different. The more wider change, I think, is about how people relate to the religious traditions of their families or not. And this seems to me an important issue. So as I mentioned early on, it's in the book, a pretty traditional upbringing, Irish Catholic New York. The sisters taught me. I was an altar boy, went to a Catholic school, entered the seminary right after high school, etc. So pretty much a Catholic family, and then doing what I've done out of that context. So many of the students today say, well, Professor, we never had that context. We didn't grow up in a straight, clear Catholic family or Jewish family or Muslim family. My parents are from India, but my father doesn't really practice much. My mother will do some kind of puja in the morning, but she doesn't explain it to us. Or we are nominally Catholic or nominally Buddhist, but we don't go to church or temple on the weekend. My mother used to be a Catholic and now she's a Buddhist. I'm upset by the hypocrisy of organized religion. I don't want to be a member of a religion. I want to keep my distance. And so at Harvard Divinity School, we have any given year in our different programs, we admit approximately maybe 150, 160 new students every year for the 2 or 3 year program. in the div school, not the PhD program, but in the divinity school. An increasing number of them come in saying spiritual but not religious. And some are, very much Catholic or Muslim, whatever, but more of them have no affiliation or multiple affiliation, seeking. And some of them will say to me, because my mother had been Catholic and now is Buddhist, and my father was Jewish but never goes to synagogue, I had to figure it out for myself. Or I don't like the way they preach, or the politics of the churches and the temples. I'm put off by it. And therefore they're on personal journeys where they're picking here and there and putting things together at ages 20, 25, 30, in a way that, there were people in the, obviously, 1960s and 70s who were experimenting and crossing over. Jews and Catholics became ISKCON, Hare Krishnas, and so on like that. It didn't begin recently. But I think more than ever before, young people who don't want to identify 100% as of one religion, totally loyal to it, but rather seeking and mixing together. I know one student recently told me that she is of a Catholic background and is initiated in an African religious tradition and doing both. And I think she didn't see it as a problem. It's just that that's what she did. And there are other ways of mixing it that 50 years ago, 60 years ago, you wouldn't do that, or at least my family would not do that. And so it was a matter of the shifting, changing times. There's also, of course, the final thing I'll say is that a place like Harvard, an increasing number of the students are, you might say, secular, who don't seem to have a religious tradition and don't seem to want one. They may change when they're 25 or 30, but some of them come in, secular parents, secular family, religion is just not an issue for them. And so all of it's changing, and therefore how we teach, who are we talking to when we give discourses or sermons, when we write books, are we doing it to a smaller and smaller number of believers, or are we also in some way trying to reach out to the wider population, many of whom are still spiritual but they're not going to show up in church on Sunday, or they won't show up here on Sunday. How do we reach the others? And everybody I think here knows people who are in the condition I'm describing, and how do we talk to our peers, our neighbors, our younger people, older people? So the world is changing, and the idea of institutional religions is kind of crumbling, at least in the US, I think, and we have to be aware of that.
On that note, let's open it up to the audience. Do we have a microphone? So you just raise your hand, and there's a gentleman right here. And tell us your name and ask the question, and keep it brief, to the point.
My name is David, and you mentioned working on something with the Virgin Mary and Kali, and I was just wondering if Mary Magdalene maybe would be a more similar figure to that. The image of Kali that I have typically is when she's stomping on Shiva, which is actually, it's wonderful because I always saw it as a one-way thing, but it seems more like a two-way relationship where they're both involved, really, and it's not just one laying down. I was thinking of Sri Ramakrishna and when he whacks Swami Vivekananda in the chest, and they all sort of. And I was wondering, what you thought about that, what you thought about Mary Magdalene and where she might fit in, and.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned in the book I did 20 years ago, Divine Mother, Blessed Mother, Kali's not in the book because I don't know Bengali and I didn't want to get into it. But then bringing her into class, I tried linking the Virgin Mary. There's the tradition of the Black Madonna that you see in parts of France In Poland, in Czestochowa, there is the Black Madonna. And even in Spain, like not far from where Ignatius Loyola came from, there's a very black Madonna with black face and so on like that. But it didn't add up to enough to really capture what I was looking for. And it's very hard to find stories of the Virgin Mary who's as kind of complicated as Kali. I hadn't thought of Mary Magdalene. We don't know that much about Mary Magdalene from the Gospels, but the traditions around her and other accounts of her as a person who had a difficult life and many challenges in her life, and became really like one of the first preachers of the gospel. She was close to Jesus. She was there at the tomb. She was one of the first people to encounter him after his resurrection. All of these things seemed to bode that she would be an interesting figure to think of. So I hadn't gone in that direction, but that would be a good idea. Thank you. Yeah.
The lady here, and then we'll go to the lady at the back.
Hi, Professor
Hi.
Clooney. I'm Priya. I was wondering if you can elaborate a bit on the intellectual faith you mentioned and how we can balance that with devotion and surrender, especially in practice. Outside of reading the scriptures and the devotional texts, wouldn't analytical, reasoning and thinking be a little challenging to devotion and surrender, especially when it involves religious or ritualistic practices?
I think, so in terms of how this actually works out, or the challenges of the intellectual inquiry and the faith, again, I'm part of a tradition that almost takes it for granted. That's what we do. And so Jesuits are very intellectual, even if they don't have PhDs. They're very intellectual, think a lot, talk a lot, question a lot, and so on. But I think still, in general, without saying that, it's certainly not saying that everyone needs a PhD or you have to do it to that depth. It's a good thing to be able to step back and ask questions about what you believe and have been told all your life. To be able to ask, well, why is that so? Or why do we do that? Or how do you know that this is the right way to do it? And then, again, depending on time and circumstances, asking, about the history of this practice or that practice, or, where do these stories come from? And then when you do the slow reading, you have a story about Krishna, let's say, and you find a version of it in the Vishnu Purana, which is different from the version of it in the Bhagavata Purana. Those raise questions about the changing development of ideas. I think all of that, again, no one's required to do any of that. But it can be good, because sometimes if we don't ask the questions and don't push, the historical issues, proofs and so on like that, it can be like our minds go this way and our hearts go that way, and you end up saying, I believe because I believe. And that may not have much influence on people around you. But if you can show that I'm believing and I'm thinking and I'm not afraid of the questions, that can be very good as well. Finally, I just say that I think we shouldn't be afraid, because God is truth. And truth is God in a certain way. That using your mind and heading to the truth brings you to the same destination as love and surrender and devotion. Because there's only, however we talk about it, there's one God, there's one truth, there's one ultimate reality, and by our minds and our hearts, we're heading to the one. Truth is one. The sages call it variously, right above your head there. Gives us a sense that to not be afraid of the questions. Thank you.
Lady at the back there. And we'll come back to you then.
Thank you. My name is Victoria. This was fabulous and wonderful. Thank you. While you were at the University of Chicago in comparative religions, I was an undergraduate in Naperville and North Central studying comparative religions. Yeah. My question is how to talk to Christians about the concept of avatar when it's so much a part of that tradition happening one time, but the idea that it might have happened more than that is sometimes a hard sell.
I think that this is a very good example of where differences come in, and differences can either end the conversation or block the way, or be an occasion for actually learning something new. So it's a commonplace, and many people who know nothing much about religion or about Hindu traditions will say, but as you just implied, I mean, in Christianity, the Son of God comes once into the world in Jesus of Nazareth and dies for the people, one life, one death, one salvation, and everybody else has one life anyway, so it's just once. People tend to have an idea that the endless kind of flow of avatars has no kind of logic to it or depth to it. And I think what I try to do sometimes with Christians is say, well, you know, here are some stories of what it meant that Vishnu became Ram, and you know that Rama and Lakshmi became Sita, and here's how it's talked about in Ramayana, Valmiki or other Ramayanas, about what does it mean for Ram to be human, even to the point of forgetting at times who he was and having to be reminded of his identity. Ramanuja writes, has some, in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, passages about what kind of a body did Krishna have in Gita 4 when he says, again and again I come into the world to restore Dharma. He actually asked the question, is this a real body, a make-believe body? So all I can do, I think, is on the one hand, get people to start to think a little bit more deeply about it by understanding what people actually believe. And also historically, you could say, well, when did the theory of 10 avatars come? That's another historical question. You know, why 10? The Gita just says again and again. And so opening up the questions both for Hindus and Christians about why do we believe this, and why do Christians believe God comes once? You know, we do say in the Bible does say, in times past, God spoke through many prophets. And this is a sense that there is multiple voices of God coming, but coming down to a theory of the incarnation as the one took time historically to develop that. So kind of talking to people about it, and then, you know, usually these are not long sessions, coming to the point of saying, okay, we probably disagree about this, but you have no reason to dismiss what you disagree with as false or evil or untrue. You can continue to learn from it. And I would say that, you know, going either way, the differences don't mean the end of the conversation, but okay, here's something beautiful I believe, here's something beautiful you believe, and they apparently are different. Let's live with that like neighbors and continue to talk to one another. That kind of thing, that helps.
Raise your hand. No, you have to raise it so that he can see you. You have to be aggressive about raising your hand. Then we'll go to the gentleman there with the mask.
Hello, Professor Clooney. My name is Amira, and my question is that, so I don't have much knowledge about Christianity, but in the Bhagavad Gita, we see Lord Krishna makes a specific decision about violence for the greater good and the war between the Pandavas and Kauravas. So when it comes to Jesus, what was his viewpoint on violence or action for the greater good in comparison to Lord Krishna? Like any similarity or difference, or how would he have taken that action if it would have come to this war in the Gita?
Even in terms of the Gita itself, this is often a question that comes up in class and all that. Like, why would Krishna urge Arjuna to get up and fight? And Arjuna has a good instinct. I don't want to kill my uncles, my teachers, my cousins. Better that I get killed than to kill them. And in a sense, this become a nonviolent person and say, I will not do this anymore. I think instinctively many of us today say, well, yes, that's the way to go. So why does Krishna then urge him? No, you know, become detached. Don't think of this in terms of friends and enemies. You're a Kshatriya, do your duty, and leave the rest in God's hands. As he says in chapter 11, Krishna, already these warriors have been killed by me. Everything is already being done by God and time. Don't worry about it. So there's a whole kind of theology around it. And then in earlier parts of the Mahabharata, like in the Udyoga Parvan, there is long discussions about why this war is to take place and trying to get out of it. There wasn't like, let's have a war and let's kill each other. But there, the long Mahabharata, there are previous sections. So we end up with this, image in the Gita and Mahabharata of Krishna urging the war on because it needs to be fought. Jesus is quite different. And that doesn't mean, different, therefore better, but different, because he's not a kshatriya, he's not a prince, he's not a king in any ordinary sense, but rather seems to be, one of an oppressed people. The Romans are running the country, taxing the people, controlling everything. The priests in the temple, some of them may be money makers. The king, Herod, seems to not be the best of people at all. So all of these things are in place, and he is kind of the person who's resisting the kind of cynical flow of things about money and power, and saying, you have to be a spiritual person even if those around you are not. And I think that's part of why he says, do not resist evil. If somebody strikes you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. Love your enemies. And that seems to be a protest against the power structure. Even though as a Jew, he was mindful that in times in the Hebrew Bible, God impelled the people to war. You must fight, and there are echoes of this all the way down to now. Fighting, bloodshed, somehow in God's name. And Jesus didn't say, therefore the entire Hebrew Bible is, now false or something like that. He just says, I say to you, be nonviolent. And so I think, again, it's is there a way in which one can say the nonviolence of Jesus teaches us to think about Krishna differently? Or understanding Krishna's sense of duty could help us to understand the context in which Jesus gives his teaching. Because he says, I'm not here to take away the law, but to fulfill the law. And so it gets complicated, but I think it needn't be one or the other, but both of them kind of next to one another. And then to admit the fact that both traditions of India and then the Christian traditions, lots of violence in the name of God. And many a Christian has gone to war and gone to crusades and killed other people while honoring Jesus, saying it's all about Jesus, and in the name of Jesus, I'm now going to kill you. People have high standards and then don't live up to them. And sometimes people say, well, you have to fight. Hitler is conquering Europe and Hitler is killing the Jews. Somebody has to stop him, and that leads to war. And is the teaching of Jesus, total radical pacifism? People debate that as well. So it's an excellent question, but it's like every other question, I guess it's complicated.
In fact, if you go to Harvard, in the church, on one wall, you will see the names of all the Harvard students who were killed fighting in First World War and Second World War. And it's right there in the church, inside the church, on one wall, covering the wall.
Yeah.
Did you raise your hand? Yes, please.
Thank you, Father. This was really insightful and learned a lot from it.
Tell us your name.
My name's Brad. I'm curious, when you have two frameworks, you have one way of seeing, you have a different way of seeing, is the closest you can get to dialogue to switch back and forth between one form of eyes and another form of eyes, and to have each get closer to another? Is it possible to create a third space that is sort of seen from both inside and outside at once and is fluent in both vocabularies, or is the closest you can get a kind of getting closer to each other but not touching?
Excellent question. I think the first thing would be that the learning one's own tradition, learning another tradition, and crossing back and forth between them is really part of our education. to be able to do that and to realize that the other tradition is different from mine. People believe things I don't, grow up believing. People practice in ways that we don't practice, and so on, and yet learning from them, going back and forth. So that is, for many people, that's the absolutely necessary starting point that may go on for a very long time. But the idea that there's like a third space in which we begin to dwell, like between the traditions or across the traditions. That may happen, because if you're the kind of person who, you're devout in your own tradition, and then you can learn from another tradition, you're different from the people in your own tradition who can't do that. And so I know many good Catholics who would never read the Gospel of Ramakrishna, would never read the Bhagavad Gita. They might not mean anything by it, they just would never ever do that. Or people who would never enter a Christian church, and so on like that. If you are the kind of person who will cross over and you're not afraid to go to Friday prayer in the mosque or the temple on Saturday or the church on Sunday, and if you read the Bible and read the Gita and you study Aquinas and study Ramanuja, you're different. And I think that maybe you have more in common with other people who do that than with the people on either side who don't do that. And so you end up with this like smaller space in the middle, like the intersecting space, where you get the people who are the crossers over, kind of spend a lot of their time there. It's like people you might you travel a lot and you meet people in the airport. The people who are always passing through airports, they have a certain kind of sense of community in Kennedy or Heathrow or whatever like that. And that's different from the people who never travel and have no idea what traveling is all about. But I think it does, so again, my book, Hindu and Catholic Priest and Scholar, it's sort of an ambiguous title, because it's like it's situating me as a certain kind of person, probably in this kind of third space, not entirely here, not entirely there, but both at the same time. And I think if you do it long enough, that may be what happens to you. Good question.
All right, we'll wrap up with this question here.
Thank you, Father Clooney.
Tell us your name.
My name is Arun. I'm actually from Boston Center.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing your journey and wisdom. I'm just going to piggyback on Brad's question here. I was thinking, you mentioned the term religious borders and also comparative theology. Is someone working on unifying theology? Because ultimately we know it's just one. And so the third space Brad was talking about, can it be it's erasing the border?
I mean, there are people who have done that for a very long time. In terms of, as I was saying before, there's one ultimate truth and one ultimate divine presence. It's not like everybody gets their own. And there are people who say, that in fact we should just do away with the differences and have like a universal religion. And to some extent, maybe Vedanta has ambitioned that, to have like, the religion that is not sectarian. The religion is not this or that, but it's the common ground of all the religions. I think, I'm not sure we're there yet for most of us. For me, the symbolism of going and coming, crossing over, crossing back, somehow works better than to say there is a universal religion that somehow rises above the Catholic and the Hindu, the Buddhist and the Jewish, and so on like that. Even back to the Rig Veda, sages call it variously. So the rishis, the Vipra people, they don't say truth is one and sages call it one, but they speak of it differently. And that, which I learned from Anantanand Rambachan, a great Hindu scholar in this country, that there's something wise about respecting the differences in how people talk and how people act and their different rituals and all that, But there are, I could give you names of scholars who like talk about theology without walls. So take down the walls and just go to the common ground, and from now on we'll not talk about the differences, we'll talk about what we have in common. That's an approach that I think maybe has some benefit to it, but I think for most of us, we're not there yet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In conclusion, I can take off from Arun's question about the future of theology, future of comparative theology, and Professor Clooney, future. What is it that you're working on? What can we look forward to? What are you looking forward to?
Yeah. I mean, the future of the disciplines and the future of interreligious learning, I think is up to you. I mean, to you and people you know and students you work with or whatever, because it's going to be what happens in 2035, 2050 and beyond, where religions go in a world that there's violence, there's sectarianism, there's anti-religious movements and all that, to kind of define the future. And not give up on the basic values of the spiritual and the true and the beautiful, it is the future. And so all of us come along and we do what we can for our time, and then it's over to somebody else. In terms of what I do, I'm getting near retirement, so I think maybe in a couple of years I'll go emeritus and not be a full-time professor anymore. I can still, as long as my health holds up, teach some more at Harvard or back at Boston College. But probably 2027, I'll go emeritus. I also have projects. I mentioned I'm working on a translation of Tamil poetry. That is supposed to be officially finished and given to the press by the end of this year. A lot of it now is refinements and so on like that. Finishing a little book on like interreligious learning. I gave some lectures that book is turning into a book. Different essays to write and so on. But also continuing to work in the parish and the like. I'm not sure what the next big project is. I have different events coming up where I'm going to give a lecture or something. Is there another like big project? I think if there is, it's taking a little bit of time to come. As I mentioned in the last chapter of the book, you can't rush it. You don't panic and write another book simply because I write books and I have to have another book. No, you don't have to have another book. But if another book kind of has fruition, then you will. But I definitely will keep doing the kind of work I do. I'll keep reading Sanskrit, Tamil. I'll keep being a Catholic priest and going back and forth. What kind of intellectually it works out when I'm aware of the scholars 20, 30, 40, 50 years younger than me doing different work, that remains to be seen. We'll see.
Wonderful. We pray to the Lord to bless him with a long and healthy and productive life. And we hope and pray that he will come back here to be with us many more times in the
Thank you.
In the
It's
future.
wonderful.
Thank you.
I want better weather the next time.
Yes. New York, New York weather. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Boston's not much better.
No,
I was getting used to New York weather. I went to Boston for a year. They said it's colder than New York.
Yeah. And this book is being donated to the library here, so it will be available.
Thank you very much.
But you can also get it online.
Yes. So that was Professor Clooney, Hindu and Catholic, priest and scholar, a love story. Big hand to Professor Clooney.
Thanks very much.
And thank you all for turning up in such large numbers. I was a little worried about the weather, but I guess so New Yorkers and Bostonians are a tough breed.
Tough people.
Tough breed, yes.
Thank you.
Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ram Krishna Arpanamastu.